Good evening this evening, and welcome to Womanspace's Focus on Women. I am Florence Rapoport, Director Emerita of Womanspace, which is, as you probably know, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to serving the needs of today's women, whatever those needs may be. We do things educational, we do things supportive, we do things social, and we do things cultural. Your participation in any or all of those things is hereby invited. This program, Focus on Women, is presenting conversations with women of interest, women famous and not so famous, women of high achievement, women of special circumstances or special problems, women in the workforce or women at home, but all women with something to say. If you or someone you know has something special that you think might be of interest to us, I'd be happy to hear from you. You can reach me, Florence Rapoport, care of Womanspace, 3 St. Paul's Place, Great Neck, New York, 11021. And that brings us to tonight's guest, Cora Weiss, founder and co-director of the Disarmament Program at the Riverside Church, that moving and shaking tower of social justice in New York, has a long history as a peace and civil rights activist. She marched for civil rights in the 50s and was a leader of Women's Strike for Peace in the 60s. She was national co-chair of the first major mobilization against the war in Vietnam on November 15, 1969. She is a member of the National Board and Executive Committee of SANE and is currently engaged in an ad hoc coalition of Women for a Meaningful Summit. The recipient of innumerable awards, Ms. Weiss has written extensively and is much in demand as a speaker and seminar leader. She is also a wife and the mother of 3 grown children, whom she sees as the reason for what she is doing. It is with great pride and high expectation that I welcome Cora Weiss.
I'm very glad to be here. I have a feeling, Florence, that you think that women are wonderful.
Somewhere along the line I've gotten that message. Certainly all the ones who have sat in that chair have been indeed wonderful. Cora, about the women who sat in that chair, which you now so beautifully occupy, my audience is kind of accustomed to knowing a little bit about the person, not just the work that she does. So would you mind if we talk a little bit about you?
Sure, as long as it's not gossip.
And how you got to be the rather, well, this is what I'm going to concentrate on, how you got to be the rather remarkable fighter for peace and social justice that you are. Then we'll talk about your work.
Very kind of you.
It's how everybody I know sees you and talks about you. You were born in New York?
I was at Sydenham Hospital in Harlem, actually, because at the time my mother was told that they have the best rates for birth, live births. And so she sought out Sydenham Hospital, which unfortunately has since closed.
Oh, a lot of changes on the New York scene and in that neighborhood particularly. Well, that was a good day for New York and the world that Cora Weiss was born at Sydenham. Not Weiss, what was your?
Rubin.
Rubin was born at Sydenham Hospital in New York. And so your education was all here in New York until college?
That's right, and I headed for the Midwest because it was halfway, I guess, between the coast and New York, and I really wanted to go to the West Coast, but that's a kind of funny story.
Is it big, long story? Tell us fast.
No, it's a wonderful story. My grandmother didn't speak English. She was an immigrant, a poet from Bialystok. And my mother hadn't yet gotten her PhD. And so when my grandmother said to my mother, "And where is the firstborn going to go to school?" my mother said, "Reed College in Oregon." And my grandmother looked and said, "And where is Oregon?" And my mother thought and thought, and she said, "It's near Japan." And so I went to Wisconsin.
Oh, that is amazing. That is amazing. And the truth is, there's a little sense there of the Steinberg cartoon of
the world.
Of the world, you know.
Madison Avenue and then the rest of the world.
Madison Avenue, a little Fifth Avenue, and then 9th Avenue, and then from there to the Pacific Coast is half an inch.
Oh, that's true.
So we are somewhat provincial, but we're also very productive and wonderful. So you went to Wisconsin, right? And you majored in?
The state of McCarthy. Joe McCarthy, that is.
Joe McCarthy.
I majored in trying to get rid of Joe McCarthy, and then I went to class. I ran a program called Joe Must Go, which was my first political experience in life, in a big way, I guess.
So you were all of 18, or maybe even only 16.
No, 18.
Smart girls got to college early. So, and Joe
We
went.
tried to recall Senator McCarthy, for which there is a constitutional provision that if you get a certain percentage of the electorate to sign a petition recalling your elected official,
It works.
it's supposed to work. But Mr. McCarthy had also seen to the judges and the courts and the officials who were supposed to review these petitions, and they found that while we had the correct number of signatures that would have recalled an elected official under normal circumstances, they weren't able to read most of the signatures, and so it didn't work. But as you know, he subsequently died of cirrhosis of the liver, and we know what causes that.
Oh, what a terrible blot on the American scene, really.
Not the
he
cirrhosis,
was. Not
McCarthy.
the cirrhosis, McCarthy himself,
That's correct.
right? So, okay, so you had a little help from God in the Get Rid of Joe campaign. But that was a wonderful experience for you in how just playing it straight and nice and clear
Well, it was
doesn't
an
always get
experience
there.
in local organizing.
Yeah.
I learned my first lesson. I was driving along in the countryside of Wisconsin and couldn't understand why eggs and tomatoes were being thrown at me. And I got out of the car one day and realized I had New York license plates. And so that was my first political experience.
Oh,
Don't
my.
bring your license plates with you when you go to another state. And it went on from there. It was a very valuable experience. It was a very sobering experience. And I got to appreciate what is now referred to as grassroots organizing.
Which is, in my view, the hope of the democracy that we both so treasure. I mean, when
Well, it's
more
the
people
greatest
get
form of
into the
democracy.
process, things will be better. Okay, so after college, you thought of
I thought I should go to
law?
law school, but at the University of Wisconsin Law School, there were 300 students, 100 in each class, and there was one woman, one black, and one Native American, and so I learned the word token,
Oh,
and I was the token woman.
that discouraged you?
I think that and having my first class at 7 o'clock in the morning in the cold dark, and the fact that I met a young man who was a lawyer, and in the 50s, you may recall, there were not two lawyers in the same household yet.
Right.
And so one of us had to give it up, and he was already the lawyer, so I gave up.
So instead of
attempt.
becoming the lawyer, it's like the new thing, don't just look to marry a
I
doctor,
became
be
the
that
client,
doctor.
not the lawyer.
You became the
If the world is
client.
divided into lawyers and clients, I became the client.
And his career became the paramount focus of your family.
Well, between that and the other paramount focus was my bearing babies. I mean, that was pretty paramount, too. We did that at the same time.
This, what year would you say this is, more or less?
56, 57.
56, 57. So you had
Yeah.
three children?
I had 3 children by the time we reached the famous 60s.
Oh, boy. All right, so when you were doing that, that's what women were doing. Smart ones?
They were either having babies or
educated ones?
picketing, and I did both.
And you managed to do both.
I brought the babies onto the demonstration line.
Oh, so you were already a participating and independent spirit, even before Betty Friedan told us what was wrong with the national scene. Well, so the women's movement remained to appear at this time in your
The
life.
women's movement, depending on when any of you came into it, sort of emerged from the peace movement of the 60s. There were several lanes, and I don't want to claim any
Yeah.
historic accuracy about any one of them, but at least the women's movement that I'm familiar with emerged from the peace movement of the 60s.
Because those women were the kind of women who understood that there was something wrong with the relegation of women to second-class status, right? They undertook to speak personally for peace.
Yes, it was a time when in the civil rights movement, there was the black separatist movement, black power movement. People felt that they had to get themselves together on their own, on common ground. Women had a lot of things in common. I used to have to leave organizing at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to pick up the kids. And the organizers used to attack me. You know, she's going. Why are you leaving?
Yeah.
And so we created an organization where we could leave at 3 o'clock. And we organized around the rest of our lives.
Cora, that's so interesting because one of my big fights is for the society to accommodate to the realities of women's lives. If so many women are working, then we need to work out child care arrangements and flex time schedules and part-time schedules to make it possible. So far, the society has been more resistant than your group.
It's true not just for women, it's true for the elderly, who still have very, very much to give in terms of production time, but they can't give it on a normal 9-to-5 day. It's too long, it's too much. So it's true for handicapped people who have much to give.
Absolutely true. So the society
when you
has
and I organize the next world, we'll have it
It'll be
perfect.
better and, in fact, perfect. Perfect is one of my favorite words. Okay, so your kids were growing up. You managed to do some picketing and organizing and pamphleteering within that framework. And then you got into a very big effort, of which I am so proud and impressed. I'd like you to just talk about it. The Peace Mobilization of 1969, the biggest of its kind ever.
Well, it was sort of a turning point in the anti-war movement, but it was only made possible because of the many years that we had spent in Women's Strike for Peace since 1960.
Organizing.
Yes. And we started Women's Strike, as you probably recall, as a statement of mothers against the nuclear testing in the atmosphere, because we were concerned that our babies were ingesting through mother's milk and bottled milk, strontium-90 and radiation fallout from this atmospheric testing. And you may recall that when President Kennedy signed the partial test ban treaty, or the half ban treaty as I call it, Jerome Wiesner, who was then his science advisor in the White House, pointed to the women who were in the street in front of the White House and said that the women and the mothers of America were certainly partly responsible for forcing that half ban. We thought out of sight, out of mind, but we soon realized that pushing testing underground would make it doubly difficult to eradicate testing altogether, which is a campaign that we're still concerned with and that is still absolutely necessary if we're going to reverse and reduce the arms race. And then, as a result...
Excuse me, it's 18 years since then, right?
Is it? Since 1960 to 87?
Is 18 years.
Well, we tend to be impatient, don't we? Americans are very sort of instant conscious. We have instant breakfast and instant juice and instant other things. And
instant health is a good goal, right? And instant peace. I mean,
but that's not a possibility. I'm talking about what I mean, in reality, we have a lot of instant things. And we also want instant satisfaction. But I think one of the things that we learned from the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War is that history has taken a very long time and that we need patience. And you cannot turn millions of people's heads around overnight. You certainly can't turn governments' heads around overnight. And of course, all of those governments are led by men, not by feminists. I wouldn't mind there being men if they were feminist men.
Right.
But at any rate, it was because of our ability that we demonstrated during the Women's Strike for Peace years, when women really were trained in the streets and in the living rooms on the facts and the figures of the arms race and disarmament and the early days of the Vietnam War. And it was a struggle in 65, 66, 67, whether Women's Strike should continue to protest testing or whether we should drop that for the moment and worry about the people 10,000 miles away whose homes and villages and hamlets were being burned and destroyed by our tax dollars. And it was a very, very interesting struggle. And the group did eventually move into the anti-Vietnam War movement. And because of that, and then we went to Vietnam, women were frequently the first to do a lot of things. We sort of felt that we really had nothing to lose, and we had everything to gain, and we were doing this for the future of our children. And that was a very strong motivation. And so we're moving now from that experience into the leadership of the mobilization, which was a huge national coalition of men and women, and there were 5 co-chairs, and I was the only woman.
I mean, that is such an interesting point you made that I never really thought about. Women had less to lose because they simply had less, right? I mean, they didn't have important jobs. They didn't have the...
And we had greater motivation because we bore children to live a future.
And were more sensitive to the threat and the danger. That's amazing. Okay,
so the mobilization was November 15, 1969, And it brought, as you may recall, and as you may recall, because you were probably there.
My audience, certainly. I mean,
I would hope so. And if you weren't, you have another chance to make up for it. There will be another demonstration this spring.
Good. They're going to get
on April 25th. And that demonstration was a turning point. It was a consolidation of elected officials. What was the senator's name from New York? Charlie Goodell.
Oh, yes,
and George McGovern, and Mrs. King, Coretta King. And it was a very interesting amalgamation of various personalities and people and groups and trade unions and workers and mothers in society. And it was a very powerful anti-war movement. And we saw the change, the trend, move from there. Unfortunately, the war didn't really end for American soldiers until 1973, and for the Vietnamese until 1975. But
without those efforts,
it was critical.
Who knows how long it might have gone on. I mean, there was such a lack of understanding about the true nature of that venture.
And people began to appreciate people power, the voice of people from the street. Because you certainly can't depend on Congress, can you, to carry out the will of the people?
Or the president. We don't want to say that. We want to try our best, right? And people power is our focus. And certainly what you are doing, and even what I'm doing in this program, this idea of raising the consciousness of people on as many issues as I can by having wonderful guests like you, makes me feel that I'm contributing something.
You are a major contributor.
Thank you,
Too bad it's
Cora.
not deductible.
Okay, so then finally, you had that wonderful experience of the mobilization. In 1973, the war came to an end, and then you did you coined a wonderful word and did a wonderful thing, friendshipment. Talk about that.
Friendshipment was a combination of friendship and shipments. And we felt very strongly that when you finish a war, you should rebuild the devastation that you've wrought.
Right.
And of course, Washington wasn't about to do that, even though President Nixon at the time had signed an agreement, or had expressed an agreement, that he would provide $3 billion for post-war aid, and it became a rather controversial item. And so people picked up where the government refused to tread, and we raised quite a bit of money and rebuilt the bombed-out hospital at Bach Mai, which people may recall, the largest teaching hospital in Southeast Asia, and built a hospital at the site of the My Lai Massacre. I'm sure that people recall the My Lai Massacre.
What a wonderful...
It's a wonderful statement. But it was a hospital built by American people, and it clearly says so outside. But I just want to say something, because it'll relate to today and the war in Central America, which is not 10,000 miles away. I left the platform of the November rally in Washington in 1969 and flew to Vietnam. It was my first trip, and I'd made 5 during the course of the war, carrying mail from the families of American prisoners of war to the POWs who were in camps in North Vietnam.
Was this with or without government sanction?
It was without, because there was no government talking to each other back and forth. And so we needed a citizen liaison, and it was called the Committee of Liaison, in order to carry out human activity. And writing letters between prisoners of war and their families is a very human activity. It was also a way of keeping track of whether POWs were alive, and who was an MIA and who was a POW and who may unfortunately have been dead. And those 5 trips to Vietnam were very, very important, because they brought back the whole notion of eyewitness reporting and civilian eyewitness reporting. And that, of course, is being done today, but in ever-increasing numbers. I mean, just so many more people are going personally to see for themselves in Nicaragua what the truth is. And that's such an important activity for citizens.
Right. It's the only way, in a sense, to get past official positions to the real truth.
To get past the lies.
I didn't want to call official. I didn't want to say that.
Well, but
it's
isn't
true.
It true that
it's absolutely true.
That's what Iran Gate has demonstrated.
Yes.
The lies, the half-truths, and the blank spaces. And so citizens are going. And they're going not
Unbelievable.
just to find out what's going on there, but to help build and to stand as a witness between the Contras and the civilians of Nicaragua in an effort to be a deterrent. That is a deterrent. Nuclear weapons are not a deterrent. We can get into that later.
You mean physical bodies there?
Sure.
American
the
bodies,
Contras don't want to
yeah.
blow up North Americans.
Right.
That wouldn't look good on the front page of the newspapers or on your video screens.
I grow in amazement at the breadth of areas of concern that you have actually dealt with and contributed
It's
to.
only one concern,
Peace
peace.
in the world.
Nothing has ever deviated from that.
Wonderful.
And what a chance we have for that now in this great new springtime opening.
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Cora, so after the war in Vietnam, after that wonderful friendshipment idea and word, I mean, that's an unforgettable word, right? You also got 10,000 tons of wheat shipped in from farmers?
Yes, American farmers contributed wheat, and we got wheat surplus, actually, from the American government. And we took the only ship that has ever left the shores of the United States for Vietnam since the end of that war. I don't know if people are aware of the fact that there's been a trade embargo. And nothing goes.
To this day?
To this minute. The only thing that goes
I didn't know that.
is what you can get a certificate for, and it has to be on a very short list of permissible goods, bandages, mercurochrome, whatever.
Medical stuff.
Medical
if any,
supplies. And any medical supply that might be able to repair a piece of machinery like a screwdriver it may not be allowed. And so there's been a tug of war between humanitarian aid groups in this country, the Mennonites and the Quakers especially, are doing a great deal of that, to try to maintain this post-war aid notion with Vietnam, because people feel properly responsible for the
damage that was done,
exactly.
pain inflicted.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so
we sent a ship of wheat from Texas to Vietnam in 1978 with 10,000 tons of wheat.
Another notch on your belt, Cora, although I shouldn't use a military analogy. Another wonderful thing that you did, and another statement about the good people in this country who are doing things and
But
caring
not alone.
about the world.
Not
alone.
I mean,
Not alone.
nothing can happen without extraordinary popular support, public
Right.
support.
Right. But what you're doing
So it
is...
demonstrates the goodwill of the American people and the basic decency of the American people.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Okay, so then you went to work with the Church World Service of the National Council of Churches. Not a religious affiliation, obviously.
No, my grandmother wouldn't have liked that, neither would I. But they're very ecumenical.
Ecumenical. And what did you do for them?
And they are the ones that ship the wheat. They are the sponsors of the shipment
they sponsored
of
that
wheat.
shipment.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So then after that, you came to the Riverside Church, finally.
Well, it was a very short trip for those of you who are familiar with Uptown New York. Uptown Manhattan at 120th Street, the National Council of Churches is on the south side of 120th Street, and Riverside Church is on the north side of 120th Street. And so I crossed
the street and made what has been an extremely productive and meaningful connection. On the off chance that people don't know a lot about the Riverside Church and its wonderful minister, William Sloane Coffin, tell us a little bit about what that church does and what you've been doing with them for the past 8 years.
Riverside is a tower of strength. You were right in your opening introduction. It's an extraordinary tower. Pete Seeger once said to me when I brought him there to sing one evening that his mother used to take him as a child on picnics across the river, and when they got across the river to the New Jersey side, they would look at Riverside, which is sort of flat at this point and then rises to a huge tower with 4 points on top of the tower, and Pete's mother called it a sleeping cat. And that's kind of a nice thought.
Oh, yes.
It's very gentle and it's very lovely.
So
and
it is both
Riverside
literally
is a
and
church.
metaphorically a tower.
Oh, yes. Riverside is a church for its members, for the community. It's a pulpit for the nation, and now it's a pulpit for the world. It's a moving and shaking pulpit, and Bill Coffin is an extraordinary leader, a man of wisdom, a person of great strength, and a person who has decided to make his mark as a peacemaker. So when he came to Riverside as the senior minister in 78, 79, the first thing he wanted to do to make his imprimatur on the church was to open a peace office. And it did indeed become the first full-time staffed disarmament office of any church in the United States. The fact that we have a Jew as a co-director and a Jew as a manager of the office and a Methodist as my co-director, and we're getting a Catholic in now as another person, has nothing to do with anything. We get the best possible people, and the congregation of the church provides the first group whom we hope to educate and bring along and activate, and then the community, and then the country. So we've done a few things there.
You've certainly embarked on that with this disarmament program of which you are co-chair, and I love the ecumenical sound of that. I was very interested in your comment about it being a national pulpit. You told me about the South African leader who spoke there.
Oliver Tambo, who is the head of the African National Congress of South Africa, received the Olof Palme Award. We memorialize Olof Palme. This was the first year. He was killed just 1 year ago, at the end of February, in Stockholm by an assassin's bullet. And Palme came to Riverside often. He called Riverside his church when he was in New York. And he spoke at 2 important Riverside conferences on peace and disarmament. And Palme, in a way, is a great hero of mine, and certainly a great visionary in the world, whose vision should not be put out with his death. And so we're trying to keep it alive. It's a vision of disarmament and development.
Cora,
yes,
we are getting very close to the end of our time, and I have dozens of more questions, and you have so much more to tell us. Do you think you could find another half hour to
I'd love to come back. It's so much fun talking with you.
Oh, thank you. You're so enlightening. Okay, so we talked about Palme and Oliver Tambo speaking from
Oliver
that pulpit.
Tambo was the speaker on January 21st at Riverside Church. We have his speech on tape and on film if anybody wants it.
Okay. We will come back next week and pick up with
Happily.
the national pulpit, the Riverside Church, the Disarmament Program, and all the wonderful things you are doing. Cora Weiss, director of that program, I thank you for being here tonight. To the audience, I say thank you for being there. This is Florence Rapoport saying good night this night, and looking forward to seeing you on our next night when Cora Weiss will be back, to our great pleasure and honor.
Thank you.
Ski New York State. We have more ski centers than any other state, cross-country and downhill. They're easy to get to, and the good times don't end on the slopes. Get a free I Love New York skiing and winter sports brochure. Dial 1-800-CALL-NYS. That's 1-800-CALL-New York State.